Really frustrated because I just wanted help with making my app that would let you code using menus. I would want help with just some simple things here or there. And instead, I had to kind of scrounge around and figure out how to maintain myself and survive. Believe it or not, I'm actually at a location where they used to have recycles and trash bins a few years ago, and I threw out all my math and computer science homework in that parking lot. They don't have those uh, disposals there anymore. But that's kind of where I am, and I got my dog. Come on, babies, come here, sis. Come on. Come here, sis. So, yeah. What I'm trying to figure out, I was listening to one of my live streams, one of my videos, and my debate with Ghost Band because his questions are related to kind of like the edge of my understanding of like how incentivization works in Bitcoin, especially when you have a network that has more hash power than the one, the POV. So you got BSV and then you got BTC, which has more hash power behind it. But BSV seems to be working just fine. And some people are not convinced. They're saying it's still centralized and stuff. But my question would be, so I pose these possibilities like, okay, so you have, these adversaries with more hash power. They can really easily put together these competing temporary chains of things that maybe are in some sense valid so that they're actually accepted on, built on. But um, like, thinking about what one of the things I don't think I understand yet properly is like what actually properly incentivizes a node to essentially send all the data, all the transactions it gets to all the other nodes. And I think there is, like, in some sense, there is an incentive for that because if you kind of break the trust of another node, because they're actually network entities, so they actually keep track of each other over time. They don't just pop up and disappear out of existence extremely fast. And even if they did, that would already be hard for honest nodes, I guess, to trust, because if they see nodes popping up and disappearing, and that's associated with untrustworthy behavior, then they're not necessarily going to give expedience to any blocks kind of built by these systems. But I don't actually know because I haven't coded anything with Bitcoin. I don't know all the exact details of like UTXO model. I don't know the details of how the timestamping between specific transactions actually works. I don't know if they can agree upon, for example, like, can they order transactions in like a Merkle tree that in like multiple data structures and have one that orders all the transactions by like literally an ordering, like an ordinal kind of structure that uses a kind of like a hash tree where you can it's like basically a data structure that allows you to easily compare live between you and another node to see if you're on the same page essentially as to what transactions have already been seen. So I would assume that you could make a data structure like that. And I'd also assume it probably doesn't need to be part of the core Bitcoin protocol because I think the protocol just defines what blocks like are. I don't know if it actually defines nodes needing to be like, basically, do they need to send information to each other, like broadcast to each other? Because I feel like that's more of an incentive thing, not like literally required, because it's not actually technically required by axiom to do that to build a block. Like, in theory, you could just somehow figure out the data yourself, from wallets sending it to all the nodes or something like that, and then they still build all the blocks. Probably wouldn't practically happen, but like, mathematically, like it's a posable concept, basically. So like, I feel like there's some sort of incentive for nodes to basically want to essentially be on the same page as each other all the time. Because if they aren't, then he kind of has a point that, like, you have another adversarial network, has more hash power, and then it can try to basically purposely ignore specific types of transactions. And then essentially from that point, attempt to convince honest nodes that, this other honest node is ignoring transactions that are, when they're actually keeping it to themselves, or that, it's not accepting their transactions, which I think that's an economic thing, though. I'm pretty sure that you don't just, you're not required to accept any transactions. You just accept them because they have a fee. See, this stuff I don't know because I don't run a Bitcoin node. I don't know how this code works. Like, I don't know how this exactly works, but I'm pretty sure the fee has to do with actually convincing a node to be like, yeah, okay, I'll literally take your transaction just for this, like, because if I don't take it, like, I might as well take it and broadcast it because it's worth the money for me to spend the electricity for the chance of getting paid for it than it would be for me to just ignore it, and then another node is probably going to see it anyway, and then they're probably not going to really like the fact that I didn't send them. It didn't help me build reputation with them to send them a valid signed transaction, so they're not really seeing me as a source of information. Like, I don't know, man. It just seems, I don't know if the anonymity is necessary, because you could also mark coins based on where they came from and be like, well, I want to ignore coins that came from this path and try to censor people that way. So somebody help me figure this out, because somebody commented on one of my videos. They're like, oh, this is what's needed. My centralized versus centralized, the two different definitions of decentralized compared on the whiteboard. Somebody's like, you're a teacher. I'm like, no, I'm actually like trying to figure this out. Like, I'm actually a student here, because I do not know. I only know a certain subset of kind of concepts going on. I don't know how. I really don't get how the incentive structures exactly work. But it doesn't mean that I don't think that Bitcoin works. I think I think the thing is that it's kind of nuanced enough to where historically most people kind of would throw out things just because they're not like convinced that it, like they don't understand the economics of it good enough to realize that it does work, or for example that it does scale. So they kind of like go do their own thing instead of like sticking around and just figuring it out with Craig. So I feel like I'm more of that. I'll stick around and try to figure it out, even if I don't really fully understand it. Because it's not about... it's kind of like the argument of like, Some people are like convinced it just by default, I'm going to say that God doesn't exist instead of that he does exist, because you would have to prove it to me for some reason that one way but not the other way. And to me that never made sense. To me it's like, well, it seems like you kind of, in a lot of choices, you want to go with like what you want to like investigate more, but then you also kind of want to go and start trying to like build or invest in this decision that makes more sense, that is more likely to be true, but not to pick one by default just because just because I mean, that's like a bias. That's like saying, like, you heard some information, and because you want to avoid scams, you're just going to assume the information is false unless somebody proves it to you otherwise. But it's like, what if their information is the opposite then? You know what I mean? Like, what if I went around and I tried to tell people something that's the opposite of what I'm actually scamming them? You know what I mean? Just so that they say, well, I'm going to assume that's not true. So I just convince them to assume the opposite of what I just said is true without any evidence. That doesn't make any sense. That's like just a logical fallacy. That has nothing to do with, weighing your options or anything. So I'm convinced it's more likely to be true that BSV incentive structure makes sense really well. And I also see evidence that it works. But I also just want to understand so I can explain to other people, like, what are the nuances when it comes to incentive to actually making sure that transactions, I guess, are submitted somewhere. I guess if there's enough nodes and you assume that they are sort of not colluding enough to some degree, then essentially you can basically conclude that you, as a wallet, you can report a transaction to multiple nodes, and one of them's going to respond by sort of reporting it to everyone else. Because and if they don't do that, then it's like you already have the beginnings of like evidence, because you're like, well, I reported this transaction, it never got put into a block. And you can show the fees, like you can start showing a history of things getting, if things actually do get rejected, I suppose you could show like a history, and you could start like building a case, because you can start recording this history in like different locations and stuff, and they won't be the longest chain if you don't have the higher hash power, but you still have like your friends know, your trusted network that you're using is now aware. And I don't know, I'm thinking about this idea because it reminds me of like when I was thinking of like trying to come up with with my protocol, that's not money, so it doesn't need a blockchain, it doesn't need double spend checking, and it's just direct peer-to-peer wallets, and that's it. Not even, you wouldn't even call it a wallet, you would just call it like an ID, and it's just straight reputation. But spammers can't fool you, because it doesn't matter how many accounts IDs they generate, they cannot fake any ratings, because their reputation is not based on a central authority like Facebook, adding up all these stars, or it's not based on all the like how many accounts voted. It's based on every account that is doing the searching of how something should be rated. Those ratings given to them are based on their own trust being the source of the flow of trust. So therefore, it doesn't matter how many scammers you got out there, unless they do genuine business with you, they cannot even start building points that you would count as points. They can build a relationship that they report to you, but you don't count that as trust until you've actually done business and it flows through that sort of chart thing. So I think that maybe the same thing happens in the Bitcoin nodes, like the full nodes. They start kind of connecting with each other, and they want to see the other nodes basically giving them information that they need. They want to be connected to other nodes that give them information about transactions that have high fees. So, and then you want to be connected with these other nodes because you want that information as well. Otherwise, you can't really build blocks. So it's kind of like a waste of money for you to mine. So it's almost like if you don't provide them the information, they're not going to be incentivized to provide you back the information. So like, I don't know. It's hard to think about, but I think this is like an important thing to figure out, because if he's asking those questions, this is something that is core to the BTC versus BSV debate. This is like an important aspect of how Bitcoin networking fundamentally works. And it's an aspect that's going to be related to potentially the downfall of BTC and being able to predict that, and the ability to sort of get businesses to realize that BSV, because businesses should already realize, this is what I don't get. You can't, because the block size scales, you should be able to go to say IBM and tell them, look, it doesn't matter if literally BSV shut down completely as a market and there's no nodes anymore. If you run a full node, you don't actually need other nodes to exist, because you could run one or two or three of your own full nodes at whatever IBM headquarters, at your IBM office buildings, or whatever company it is, right? And you can use it as a data service. And just because that's true, ironically, it also implies that the network probably will exist, because the fact that it's that good at just doing a job independently, and it just happens to work with the rest of the world. Like, yeah, you can use it for trade and stuff. You can use it as cash. But like, the point is, like, every company can kind of use it also as an internal basis for an internal immutable storage tool. Like, banks can use it to store. It doesn't matter if it's not going to crash, as in the code is going to crash, right? But it doesn't matter if say the price or whatever, or the number of nodes out there crashes. You're not gonna. It doesn't even matter if there's another network like BTC that has higher hash power, because you already know what your internal nodes are doing, because you're the one managing them. So if, say, I'm an IBM executive, or I'm a Google executive, or whatever, I have my own BSV nodes running that I'm storing data on that I want to store on, right? So it doesn't matter that BTC or something else would have higher hash power, because they're not going to deceive my node as to what any blocks that I created, right? And say somebody else makes a block. Okay, well, all the information, all the transactions that I wanted to submit, I can check. All my computers are going to tell me whether those transactions are in the block. So if they're not, I can just say, well, why are they not, in the block, and start just building my own blocks, because it doesn't matter at that point. You don't even need hash power. To run a database on my own computer, I don't need hash power. I don't need to compete with anyone, because all I'm doing on my own computer is just seeing that I'm storing my own data, and I have my own identifiers, my own wallets, and then my own hashes, right? I'm just speaking hypothetically, like, how do they not get this? You don't even... Like, if you just run your own node, then you don't need to care about what anyone else ultimately is doing, because all the other nodes could turn on you and you would still have at least your immutable data, which is what they should be using the tool for. Like, that's what I don't get. And ultimately that's not how it would work. Ultimately, IBM would actually be doing something differently. They would have a node, but it would just be a listener, because they would realize that it's cheaper. It's probably going to be like 100 times cheaper to let the network... They're going to realize that the network is dependable, and it's 100 times cheaper for them to just put the data on the network. And then their node is just there as a backup, as a listener. But they realize that they don't need to waste electricity on it, because the network is so efficient that it's just storing all the data that they need and is doing everything they need. And if somehow the rest of the network were to shut down, well, their listener node has all the data. So there's nothing... Their listener node is still there as a real node. It's just decided to slow down. So it's not shut down, it's just slowed down to be not using energy. That's it. So, like, I don't know if people understand. Businesses should be building everything on BSV, I think. Like, if I was them, if I was Google or Facebook or Apple or any of these companies, I'd be like, oh, yeah, no, this actually works. We're gonna start putting, like, our like messages, social media posts. We're gonna start putting that on this blockchain so that nobody can screw with it. So we can, like, commoditize that, right? Like, let's start putting our videos, like, at least on a side chain, if not on the direct chain, if you think it's too expensive. At least they'll be there. Because now you can at least use the rest. Because to me, the way it works is you're just building a database, but now you're opening up the possibility of somebody else economically wanting to store your data for you. So if you think about it, like why would people care about price or market crashing, or whether, quote unquote, BSV were to win instead of BTC? Why would they care about any of that when that doesn't actually have anything to do with it working as a database for you, being just a positive? And if it happens to not do that, well, at worst, it's just another database. It's just another immutable. It's just you just stored data on a blockchain. Big deal. What did that cost you? Didn't cost you anything. So yeah, I don't know. I'm talking about two subjects here, I guess. I'm talking about it. It seems too obvious that businesses should just use BSV and run their own full node and not care about what is going on in the BSV network, because no matter what happens to the BSV network, they're still just storing immutable data, which is still going to be useful. But most likely they'll get benefits by the network, processing and storing data for them and helping them move data around. So it seems like it's only upside. And then number two, I'm also trying to figure out how to work with this debate that I had with Ghostband with BTC versus BSV in the hash power, and how I'm trying to figure out every hypothetical with an adversarial network, and I'm trying to figure out like what incentivizes a node to really want to make sure that it actually sends all the transactions to another node. And like if you're an adversarial node, I guess my question is, does that mean that it's like really not economical to kind of withhold a transaction? Because obviously if I'm an adversarial node, I could make an adversarial wallet and then make some transactions and send those out to other adversarial nodes. But if it works anything like my own protocol that I came up with, which is not Bitcoin, but it's the reputation protocol, then if it works anything like that, then it doesn't matter how many adversarial nodes there are. It doesn't matter how much spam nodes there are. They're not going to. It's only going to be based on the trust is always going to come from the entity that's doing the trusting. So, but I don't know if that works with hash power too, because you can do proof of work, which is like a universal value. It's trying to find like a universal like value. But I know in my protocol that I came up with, which is not money, it's reputation, you start from yourself and you get all these signed reputation data from people you do business with, and then kind of like the Google PageRank algorithm, it goes through like water and it computes how much you trust them based on trusting yourself first and then flowing out from there. So that way, it doesn't matter how they're all connected, but anyone who's trying to do scam stuff will have to do genuine business or trick you that they're doing genuine business with you in order for you to flow that trust to them. That's not using any proof of work, though, as a universal kind of sort of a universal tax, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. Universal way of trying to make things less spammy, I guess. But we're in the context of more potentially having proof of work being the spam because it might be backed by like, this temporary BTC network, and they might have, a lot of adversarial ability because of hash power. And if we're just assuming that's the case. And even if that's the case, I'm still trying to make an argument, I think, that you can't ultimately spam these honest nodes that are able to connect with each other enough, I guess. Because they're going to see higher, like, in order to continue trying to in order for the spam nodes to continue making themselves look good by trying to hide transactions from some honest nodes to make them look bad, or the more they try to only send transactions to each other but not to the other honest nodes, I think the more the honest nodes are ultimately from that second one, the honest nodes are going to more connect to each other, because if they do receive any transactions that actually have a decent fee, they'll want to listen and build reputation with other nodes that are sending those transactions with decent fees. And yeah, I don't know, just to run that network. And then they can also ignore. So I think the way it works is if they're hiding transactions from the rest of the network, well, I mean, that's their choice, but I guess that's why nodes just go with whatever they see first. right? So when they see a transaction, they just say, okay, that's the first one I saw, and I'm going to decide whether I accept it based on the fee or not. So if the honest nodes do build a block, you know, they might not have seen that transaction that the other node was, the adversarial node was trying to hide from them. So I guess the adversarial node, I guess, is risking that might happen. See, that's what I don't get. This is what I don't understand. What is the incentive to send that transaction out, though? Because if the adversarial node is more than 50% of the network, right? If there's more than 50% of the hash power, it is kind of tricky because, like he does have a good point. That's the thing. Like, if the adversarial nodes are more than 50% of the hash power, like, what's he saying? What makes BSV better than Staller or ICP? I don't know. Because, first of all, I don't think I've ever heard of Staller. And ICP, I've seen the paper once, and it was huge. And I thought it said something about proof of stake, but I can't remember. And I don't know if proof of stake makes any sense. Because I think, like, it's... if it is what it sounds like you're just like, how do you lose your stake if you do something sort of wrong, I guess? I mean, the thing about it's really weird because, like, the thing about hashes is you can prove one direction. Like, you can prove what the past is, but you can't prove what the future is. Like, you can prove that a transaction exists, but you can't prove that a transaction doesn't exist. So it's kind of like, I don't know what a stellar XLM is. But, like, I'm trying to figure out, like, in the white paper, you know, he's got a point that it says, you know, 51% hash power is, like, important for that one aspect. But I'm trying to figure out, like, can it still work even if you don't have the freaking 51% hash power? Like, can it still work somehow, or is it basically just Sybil attack after that? Because really, like, if you're connected in a clique, like, if you're well connected to, like, a bunch of other nodes, and say they do have 51% of the hash power or more, but say that all the nodes, all the honest nodes at least, have connection to, say, 60% or more of the other nodes, well, then, okay, then maybe it still would work because the adversarial nodes can try to do what I was saying, where they're withholding transactions, or they try to pose boy, I can't think right now. They're withholding transactions on purpose to try to make some of the honest nodes look bad. But that seems to only make sense if they're between the honest nodes, because the honest nodes can just tell each other everything that they see. And they're not going to know which other nodes are necessarily honest, but they will be able to just sort of build blocks on whatever they see. So as long as, you know, it works that way, like, what I'm trying to understand is, like, by withholding, okay, so if they have more hash power, but the network is connected well, my question is it still non-economical for the adversarial nodes to then withhold transactions? That's what I want to know. Because technically, like, okay, they have more hash power. They also see the honest transactions with fees. They can also build blocks and make, like, value income on those honest blocks. But now they have more transactions that they're, like, not telling everyone, but they're just keeping to themselves, which is more than 50% of the network. But just because they're using wallets to, like, make more transactions, does that actually mean that they're going to be able to make more blocks because they have more data? Like, is there a limit to how much data you need for it to be allowed to be a block, or is it just an average of 10 minutes on ASICs? Right? Like, that's what I want to know. Like, how does that work with the timestamping? Like, does it somehow give you an advantage if you have 51% of the network or more and you're withholding knowledge of transactions that you could be making yourself from the rest of the network? Um, or, because obviously if you're telling them, and then also if you put high enough fees, you're going to be paying for that if they build blocks. But, like, does that break the network or not? And I guess I'm going to have to pose that question to Craig and Kurt, like, maybe on Twitter tonight or something. Staller, ICP, and XLM. I don't know I don't even know what XLM is. I'll have to look that up. Let me take I need to take, like, a screenshot of that. Because I don't know. I'll have to look those up. I do not know what XLM is. And I don't know what, I'm not sure if I can even explain why I don't think proof of stake makes sense. Because I'm not really sure I'm convinced I understand why proof of work even completely makes sense, other than that it's just generally anti-spam. Because I feel like that makes the most sense. I don't think it makes sense that you would want to just incentivize, like, indefinitely more hash power, just as a general exponential rule of thumb. Because, I mean, let's say you have super high hash power. It's like, okay, you'll be the first one to find a block, but you still have to get paid by whatever the transaction fees are. So, and plus the difficulty would adjust to kind of make it only worthwhile. I don't know. Something. It seems to me like it adds to the anti-spamming, because ultimately you have to, like, you have to make sure somebody's going to try to spam the network. You're going to have to check to make sure the blocks are valid. So it seems like it needs to be, like, half the work needs to be, like, just merkling millions of transactions at some point. I feel like that, for some reason, I feel like that has to be the case. Like, it has to be a certain, like, it has to be some kind of percentage. Like, otherwise it doesn't seem like it would make sense. Like, it can't just be exponentially more cost to do the proof of work nonce checking than to be merkling the transactions. It seems like it should be more like the other way around, where that should level off and be the same, whereas checking more transactions kind of grows, like, linearly with the size of the block or whatever. Or, log n times n, whatever the size of the block. Man, This is very interesting though, because what his question was good. I mean, I'm calling it a question because I'm being nice. I mean, technically, he just made a wrong proposition because he just said it must be that P is greater than Q or whatever, you know. Well, it needs to be for that. When you have an assumption, then it's the conclusion. You can only assume that the conclusion is true based on the assumption. But that doesn't prove that the conclusion, first of all, is not true if the assumption is not true. But it also doesn't mean that the system breaks even if the conclusion is false. So, like, um, yeah. But I mean, BSV is working and BTC has more hash power. So, I mean, I mean, already practically speaking, I mean, it seems like we're in the clear. So, there might already be a decent economic explanation for just that, I suppose. I don't know. I've talked about this for looks like 41 minutes. So, guys, that's all I can think of right now. I can't I can't think of anything else. I can't answer that question yet. I got to figure this out. Like, I want to figure it out tonight, but I don't know. So, let me rephrase this question again. Can an adversarial network of nodes which have more than 50% of the hash power continuously be building a longer chain that ignores specific valid transactions, or at least can they start can they take advantage economically of the fact that they can do transactions without telling the rest of the node, the rest of the nodes. Because if you think about that, that's even scarier because that's like, so they're not going to do anything adversarial in the process, except they're going to just take over the network because the fact that they're able to hide transactions without telling everyone. So that's kind of what I'm getting at is like, let's say I owned most of the nodes out there, right? And I wanted to keep it that way. And now I'm controlling basically the entire network because any nodes that are not under my direct control, I do not give all the transaction information to. And I withhold it from those specifically. And if that's the case, do they have an advantage? Like, obviously they want to know because nodes want to hear information. So it's like a disadvantage to not hear the information. But apparently it's also a disadvantage not to tell someone the information. But I think that's assuming that, like, you know, you're just trying to survive. So you're trying to get the best like, you're trying to make the best connections you can and get the best reputation you can. But if somebody's controlling most of the nodes, if they're controlling most of the nodes, and then they start doing all these transactions without telling the honest nodes, does that mean that they get more block fees on average? Does that mean that they get more? Does it help them? Because the only thing that allows you to build a block, right, is you have to have what is it? Like you have to put all the transactions that happened within that period of time together, and then, or sorry, all the ones that you're willing to accept the fees for, put them together in a block, and then get paid for it. Get a nonce. So I guess you could put like, I guess an empty block would be a valid block then, because you just rejected all the transactions. So it's just empty. So then it would be valid because you just decided to reject all the transactions, and maybe that's why you have the universal proof of work cost to kind of make that just hard to spam, I guess. I mean, because the nodes could obviously decide not to build on that block, because technically they can just do whatever they can really do whatever they want. Technically, because you could make another, you could just ignore hmm. Yeah, guys, these are the parts of the Bitcoin that I don't feel like I really understand completely. This is a part where I'm not convinced I understand it properly. Like, it makes more sense. Like, yeah, if your chain is the top chain, then it makes sense. I get it. Because that would be totally uneconomical. But when you have some weird situation like this with BTC, then it's like, what is actually going on? This is so weird. Because you actually have, like, literally a fake Bitcoin with more hash power than the real Bitcoin. So it's actually able to potentially spam it, but it might still be costly. But, like, how costly? Like, what are the metric? Like, how do you even measure this stuff? This is stuff that I need to start thinking about, because yeah, I don't really know how this works when that happens. Somebody controls most of the nodes, then they can try to like not give all the transaction information to the other nodes. You have I never really thought about that. When I heard about empty blocks being spam, I was like, well, can't you just check that? But, like, it's funny to think about, because yeah, they are valid. They're just valid blocks with no accepted transactions. Because I don't know how this really works, but it seems like you just accept whatever transactions you want. And so the incentive is to accept. Ideally, the incentive would be accept more transactions to get more fees, and ignore anything with too small of fees to be worth even processing, or trying to merkle together. Like, but that makes sense in an economic environment, in a competing environment. But if you don't have if you don't have 51% or more of the hash power being honest nodes, and you have something like specifically, say, adversarial BTC miners that want to shut you down or something like that, what can you conclude about the network? Like, how does it work at that point? Because now they have to decide, like, I guess, what's a valid block from their own opinion, like from their own. They have to decide. I mean, if somebody builds a block, and they don't include the transactions that you've seen, then that means you can still build a block with all the transactions that you've seen that they just ignored. So I guess they didn't actually slow you down, but you just have to nonce check against that new one if the other nodes accepted it. So they verify it, they accept it, and they say, okay, we're going to build on it. But it just means that there's going to be more. All it means is that they've just increased the difficulty. So I don't know if difficulty. Maybe if you. Okay, here's the thing. I think I know maybe a solution to this. Okay, so maybe the way it could work is, say somebody submits a whole bunch of empty blocks, but that doesn't mean that the difficulty necessarily should just increase. Maybe what it means is that if you build another block and you can show that there were transactions that were ignored in the block before, well, then basically the difficulty can't adjust, and that has to be merkled into your block now, because basically they're ignoring timestamping that the honest nodes have recognized, because they're not. Does that make sense? Because if they're going to ignore any transactions should have a timestamp. So, and then an honest node, any node will trust itself. So an honest node by default trusts itself, right? And it's going to know, like, oh, somebody made a block that just happened to not include a transaction that I knew about. And because of that, I'm going to consider it valid to kind of fix something about, like, I can take that information, but I'm allowed to assert that, hey, I saw this other transaction. And so now it's like more of a debate now for the other. So there's going to be another honest node that doesn't know that this is an honest node. And he's going to be like, well, why did you have this transaction? And, like, maybe he might wonder, okay, well, this guy had a transaction, but I never heard about it. Well, I think at this point now, what they can do is they can basically be like, okay, I'm going to send you the like, they're going to agree to, like, send each other transactions that they see when they see them, because they're not going to know right off the bat whether they trust each other. But now that they've seen that there's a problem, they're like, okay, I'm just going to send you directly these transactions. You send me any of them. And then from that point on, they will realize, if there's another node out there that, regardless of what they do, build an empty block or something, they'll know Well, I sent the transaction to him. You know that you sent the transaction to him. So we know that, they're not accepting, they're not listening to what we've reported. So there's got to be something in that breaks the protocol then, because they're not doing something that matches the timestamping. So there's got something about that has to be, I'd assume, breaking the protocol then. It just makes sense. It doesn't make sense. Not like I so. And then when it comes to, say, you're an honest node, right? You don't know who else is honest or not, but you see a node that produces a block that does not have, that has transactions, that you were never told about. So you find out about the block and you're like, okay, well, why was I not told about this transaction when the transaction happened? And at that point, they're not breaking a protocol, but now it's like, how does the network trust you that you knew, like you didn't know about the transaction? You can't prove that you didn't know about it. So I guess at that point, what you do is you ask. So then what you do is you would build trust with another node by essentially, like, or you couldn't, I guess you couldn't build trust with another node, but you could try to like ask other nodes like to send you information. Be like, you just say, hey, see these transactions. Could you please, if you see something like that again, just send me this information. And I guess one of two things will happen. Either they will start sending you all the transactions that you needed to hear, in which case you'll kind of build trust, but then you'll lose trust with the other node a little bit for not telling you. Which that presents a whole nother graph theory, like strategic weird thing that could go on, because that could be an adversarial way of trying to control you, maybe. Or they don't send you the information, and then you basically have a proof where you can show them like, hey, I asked you to send me all the transactions. They just built a block. Now I know that you didn't send me the transactions, right? And you basically sort of establish that the relationship is not like trustworthy. At least for you, at least you as a node know that other node is not agreeing with you that the third node is hiding things on purpose. Because you can't do things by vote at that point. By the time they have most of the hash power, it's like they could establish more nodes. You can't vote because they would just vote that they're the honest nodes, right? That doesn't make any sense. Like, they can't vote. There has to be some sort of proof. There has to be some sort of way of like showing that they're not sending, and maybe the way it works is you could accuse them. You could be like, you're not broadcasting, you never broadcast these transactions to me. And they would have to come up with some sort of, maybe they would need some sort of network evidence. So can you send things on a network and then sort of there's evidence that shows that you sent it to someone or that you sent it through another third party? So I guess you could do that, and then that would, instead of being a voting system, it would be a system of of evidence, because the evidence is in the block. All right, I'll see you guys next time. I'm going to cut this off after an hour.